Welcome back to Let's Make a Game, a channel about making computer role-playing games using the free program Twine and the Sugarcube format for Twine. In this video, I would like to keep talking about the combat system that I am coding to be part of a viewer's game. So we have this opening screen. It is the same as what we saw in the previous video. We have a set of avatars, 4 of them, representing the 4 different classes that your character can be. You can choose a male or female avatar. It doesn't make any statistical difference. It's just a different picture. But when we choose one of them, we will see something new. So we have this quite big list of what seem to be, and in fact are, enemies. So we have just a number, so we know how many there are. In this case, 14. There are, it has their type, which says male in this case, and then we have all of their hit points, and we have up here a location, the brewery. So what's happening here? Well, in some games, the environment is randomly generated each time. So if you start at a particular place, you go north, you go west, there's a monster there, for example. The next time you play the game, you might go north and then you can't go west, or you might go north and then west, and there's an apparently empty room there with some secret doors instead of the monster. Or you know, that's an example from fantasy, but of course you can do this in other genres as well. In other games, the environment is the same each time. So if you play the game once and explore, and you find a spaceship that's crashed, and then you explore the spaceship, and in the spaceship there's a recording of made by the crew before they crashed. Well, next time you play the game, the spaceship will be in the same place, and the recording will be inside the spaceship in the same place. This game is of the second type. And of course you can have a combination of the two. You can have sort of set encounters. Well, there's definitely a dragon here, and you have to and if you defeat this dragon, you get some magical item that's necessary to sort of progress to the next stage of the game. But in the forest, sort of before you get to the cave, there's mostly random encounters. Maybe there's a witch's hut there. But then there's a lot of wiggle room about what monsters you meet and when. But this game is very much of the set type. There is a specific map. The connections are the same each time, and the combat encounters are the same each time, or at least there are set combat encounters. And this is basically this is not intended to be what you see in the game. It's just for testing purposes. This is the combat encounter that you would have at the brewery, which is one of the locations in the game. So the game is based around fighting giant mosquitoes and trying to find out why your town has been invaded by giant mosquitoes, and trying to sort of find a solution to it. But in the meantime, you do have to sort of fight off the invasion. And it has very few monster types. It's not like a fantasy game where you might have 50 different types of monsters. The monster is giant mosquitoes, and most of them are male mosquitoes or female mosquitoes, so who have slightly different stats. And that's why the type is just male, 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 male. This is an encounter with a group of 14 male mosquitoes. Their hit points are rolled each time, so those will be different. But each time you go to the brewery, you will be fighting 14 male mosquitoes. So what I've coded that I'm going to show you today is a system where when the game gets to a given location that has a combat encounter, it can extract the data for that encounter and set up the combat. So let's have a look at the code that allows that to happen. Before I do that, though, I should talk about the volume situation, the ongoing sort of problems that some people have reported with the videos being too quiet. I have downloaded the software that I was talking about, but I haven't yet had time to familiarize myself with it, so I'm not using it in this video. I'm just using the same inadequate setup that I have been using. So I'm sorry about that. I've been unusually busy of late, so you know, hopefully I'll be able to get that fixed soon. All right, so let's have a look at the code. So we're dealing with an entirely new thing. We're dealing with enemies, and we haven't sort of, I mean, it's not new for the course. I've done videos on enemies before, but I mean, it's new for this program. We've only dealt, so in previous videos, I've only dealt with creating the character. So we've got an entirely new sort of thing, and because we've got an entirely new thing, we have lots of new variables. So I'll go through them. I will say that I've made a couple of other changes that aren't directly to do with adding in enemies, so I'll probably talk to you about those. They're just things that I did that were a bit sloppy that I have fixed. One of the things is that in story caption, which is the page that deals with the sidebar where your character is printed, I have a for loop, and I was just using $Z for that for loop, which is the first variable that I use for just any temporary thing that I need. So if I'm doing a for loop, if I can, I'll use $Z for the number to keep track of the loop. But that's not good practice to use the same variable name in story caption as in the main page, because what happens in story caption might affect, well, it will affect the value of Z, and if the page has a value of Z that is carried over from one page to the next, you don't want Z to be altered by the sidebar. You'll start getting results that aren't what you want. So you should have separate variables that are just for the sidebar. And I often use $SB, which just stands for sidebar. And I sort of neglected to do that in this case, and I fixed that. So that now has $SB instead of Z, which, because I'm not going to use $SB anywhere else, there's never going to be any code that relies on the value of SB, and therefore there's no possibility that it will sort of create an unexpected outcome and some sort of either, you know, crash the game or at least make it do what it's not meant to do. The other thing that I've done, and I did mention that this was bad coding, the loop went from 1 to 4. There are 4 attributes. And normally you shouldn't have the number hard-coded like that. You should have a variable that is the number of attributes and then have loops that go from 1 to that variable, because then you can just change the variable if you want to add or get rid of a particular attribute. If you decide that you've got, for example, you might have, I don't know, swordplay and archery or something, and you find that you're not using archery, and so you decide to get rid of it. And so therefore you reduce the number of attributes by 1. Well, every time you go through all of the attributes, you'd have to go through and reduce that number by 1. But if you've got a variable, which is the number of attributes, you only have to change it in one place. And then you probably have to change an array that is the names of the attributes as well. But that should all be on the sort of first page, and so it's easy to change. So I've done that. I've got $ATT_NUM, which is of course, attribute number. It's how many attributes there are, and that is set to 4 at the beginning. All right, so let's look at the changes that are to do with introducing enemies. So I have these variables COM, they're to do with companions. That's something I was going to do and I decided not to do yet. So they're in the code, but they're not yet used. All right, so we have $ENC_DET, so that stands for encounter details. And these are the set combat encounters. And in each slot of this array, each slot of the array is itself an array, so it's a two-dimensional array. And we have slot 0 is the place, so it's easy to look at this and go, all right, I'm thinking about the combat that takes place on the bridge. Well, which one's that? Well, it's obviously this one here. And then it has the 3 different types of enemies that there are, which are males, females, and pupae, which are the sort of baby ones. And it has the number of each. So the bridge encounter, we have 3 males, 4 females, and 0 pupae. You might notice there's 0 pupae in any of these set combat encounters. I think the pupae are going to appear in a different encounter, which I don't have the details of. I'm not completely sure, but yeah, it just has the number of each one. So downtown cafe, that's 1 male and nothing else. Nightclub, that's 1 female. The megastore is 2 females. The Durian Roundabout is, which I think is the name of a cafe or something like that. Maybe, I'm not sure. That's 1 male and 1 female, and so on. So how do I know that that's a male, that's a female, and that's a pupae? Well, there's an array that appears later that gives the names of the different types of monsters. I should notice, as a side thing, in the previous video, I had one array that's the names of the different character classes, essentially, and I had another array that's the numbers, their stats. But I think it's easier to have them together because I can go, well, this one's obviously the stats for the scoundrel. And so we'll put that in slot 0, and then slots 1 to 4 will be the stats. So I sort of merged two different variables into one. So sorry, that's another side change that I made that I haven't, that I forgot to mention before. And of course, I changed all the references to that previous array of the names of the different types when you're choosing your character and when you're displaying the picture. Obviously that needs to refer now to this. Where is it again? It needs to refer to the 0th slot of this variable rather than the separate array, which was the names. All right. I've also set up a variable which is the number of possible personas and used that for loops where we display the pictures of all of the possible personas, which is what happens when you're choosing your character. Again, I don't think this is going to change much because there's 4 attributes and 4 classes, and each class is sort of good at 1 attribute, and each possible value for each attribute appears in exactly one class. So it's sort of very symmetrical. So it would be sort of difficult to add a 5th class, but just in case, and because it's better, sort of better practice, I've created my own variable. All right. Created a separate variable for how many of them there are. All right. So NME, this is possibly one of the more important ones. This is the details of the creatures you're currently fighting. So slot 1, again, it's a 2-dimensional array. Slot 1 is its type, and slot 2 is its hit points. And again, the type will be a number, and what that number means is in this enemy underscore ATT, which we'll encounter down here. All right, so we have enemy. This is a lot to remember, but you probably don't have to remember this all. I'll sort of remind you as we go through the code. So enemy is the details of the current sets of enemies that you're fighting. Enemy underscore max is the maximum number of enemies, which seems to be 15. But again, you could change, because it's a variable, it's easy to change. Then we have a for loop that goes from 1 to this enemy max, so in this case 15, and sets every slot to be an array because it's going to be a two-dimensional array. Then we have enemy underscore TYP, which equals 3. That is the different types of enemy, how many different types exist in the game, and there's only 3. And then we have enemy num, which is how many enemies you face at the start of a combat. And then each of those enemies is detailed in the enemy array. And here we have enemy underscore ATT, which stands for enemy attributes. And this is the stats of the different types of enemies by type. And it's a very, almost the same format, in fact, exactly the same format really, as this, where slot 0 is the name of the type, and then we have their different attributes in order as it appears in this array. So they're strong, smart, sneaky, and sexy stats in that order. So we can see that males have 1 strong, 1 smart, 1 sneaky, and 0 sexy. I guess their charisma doesn't, which is basically what sexy is. I guess the monster's charisma isn't really relevant, but they're still given a stat just in case. The females are basically the same, except they're sort of a bit more dangerous, I guess. And then the pupa are sort of better at some things and worse than at others compared to the males. All right. And then we just have a little explanation of what this means. NME underscore ATTZY is what value $ATT name Y, which is the names of the attributes, has for enemy type Z as a number, except that slot Z0 is the name. So we can see that in there in the data. We have the name and then the 4 attributes. And all of this we've seen before, except for SB, which I've already explained. Okay, so there's quite a lot of new variables, but don't worry, because I'll explain what they are. And also the names are reasonably, reasonably explanatory. Enemy max, well, that's the maximum number of enemies. Enemy TYP, so enemy type, that's the number of types of enemies. Enemy ATT, well, that's enemy attributes, so that's going to be the attributes of the enemies by type. So it's still a bit complicated, but you can sort of guess what they mean from the names. All right, so we're going to set up combat. We set Z equal to a random number from 1 to 9. Why 1 to 9? Well, because that's the number of set combat encounters that there are. Now, this is for testing only. There's no situation in the final game where you get a random preset encounter, because what encounter you get depends where you go, right? The bridge encounter takes place at the bridge, and the bridge is always in a specific place. So this is not a thing that's going to be in the final game. This is just a thing that allows us to set up a combat, and then we're going to sort of run the combat and see if it works properly. And then and then when the author writes the game, they can call the specific combat based on where the players are. All right. So we have 2 for loops, and these for loops, one of which is very simple, one of which is a little bit more complicated. You can see that it's one loop within another loop. And we could have, as the note says, we could have done these 2 loops in a single loop. They're both from 1 to enemy underscore TYP, i.e. we're going through all of the different types of enemies, which is 3 at the moment. But I thought it would be easier to follow if we did it in 2 lots, so I've done it that way. All right. So we set enemy underscore NUM to 0. That's the number of enemies that we're facing. We have a for loop that goes from 1 to enemy TYP, and we set enemy underscore num, the number of enemies we're facing, plus equals. In other words, we add this, whatever's on the right-hand side of this, we add to its current value. So it starts at 0 and then it goes up. And we add ENC underscore DET, so encounter details, ZY. Z being the number of the encounter, which we determined up here, Y being the type. So we look at, let's say Z is 6. We look at 6.1, 6.2, and 6.3. And we go through that and we say, right, the encounter at the temple, it has 5 males, so I'll add 5 to the number of enemies. It has 1 female, so I'll make that 6. It has 0 pupae. Okay, so at the end of that for loop, we know that enemy num is 6. In other words, we are facing 6 enemies. Now, we write the details of those enemies into the enemy array. And I've just noticed that I've got a comma there that shouldn't be there. All right. Or I could put a full stop there. I think that's probably what I meant to do and mistyped. But anyway. So we set W equals 1. W is just a temporary variable. I've added, actually I forgot to mention that when we went down the bottom here. I think I only had Z listed as a temporary variable. What I usually do for temporary variables is I start from Z and then I go Y, X, W, and then Z2, Y2, X2, W2 if we need to have like 7 or 8 different temporary variables. But at the moment, we've only gone as far back as W. So we set W equals to 1, and as it says here, it's which slot of enemy to write into next. So of course, we are, as you can imagine, we want to write into slot 1, then slot 2, then slot 3, then slot 4. But the for loop that we're doing won't allow us to find that number easily. So that's why we need a separate variable. So we have a for loop that goes from 1 to enemy underscore type. So we go through the 3 types of monsters. And then for each of the 3 types, we have a for loop that goes from 1 to ENC underscore DET ZY. So let's look at an example of what that means. Let's say Z is, say, 6. We'll start with Y equal to 1. Then we'll look at ENC DET 6, 1. So that would mean we were in the temple again, and we'd look at 6, 1, and we'd see, okay, that's 5. So we need to write 5 males into, the enemy array. So therefore we have the X loop is going to go from 1 to, in this case, 5. And then for each slot, we set enemy W1 equal to Y, because remember, enemy Z1 is its type. It's a number representing whether it's male, female, or a pupae. And then we generate its hit points, and the formula for hit points which the author of the game has told me, is that you get the strong attribute, multiply that by 2, and then add 2d6. That is, we simulate 2 rolls of a 6-sided die. And we do that, or a roll of 2 different 6-sided dice, I suppose. And we do that with the random command. So we have random bracket 1, comma 6, end bracket, plus random bracket 1, comma 6. You might say, well, why don't you just have a single random 2, comma 12? Well, that will give the correct range of results, but it won't give the correct probabilities. When you do it this way, when you have random 1 to 6 plus random 1 to 6, the results cluster in the middle. So you tend to get a lot of 7s and you tend to get very few 2s or 12s. And the reason for that is there's many different ways to roll a 7. You can get 3 and a 4 or a 1 and a 5, etc. There's only one way to do a 2, which is 2 1s. There's only one way to do a 12, which is a 6 and a 6. So and as you get further from the middle to the edges, the numbers of ways to get that result gets fewer. So random 2, 12 would give an equal probability of 2 or 12 or 7, whereas doing it this way gives a cluster in the middle. So 2 dice plus 2 times enemy underscore ATT, which is enemy attributes. Why? Because we're dealing with the type. And then 1, because the strong attribute is the one that's in slot 1. And then, because we don't want to write, next time we don't want to overwrite that slot, we want to write into a different slot of the array, we set W++. In other words, we just add 1 to it. So next time, the first time we go through this, we'll write into slot 1. And then the next time we'll do slot 2 and slot 3 and slot 4. And of course, that's what we want to do. Now, and that will give the details of all of the monsters, all of the monsters that we're facing. And then we just display them. Again, this says, again, I've noted for myself, this is for testing only, because the actual display is intended to be visual. And I've talked about that in the first videos in this series, the first video in this series. But that's going to be a bit of work to make that display. So I'm just going to sort of do the mechanics of combat first, and then we'll look at the display. So this, I won't go through this entirely. It just prints what you saw. It prints a heading, and the heading is, first of all, where is this combat taking place, which is listed in ENC_DET. In the real game, this is probably not going to be used. I don't know, but it probably won't end up being used. It's just for reference for the programmer, for myself, and then for the person who's making the game, so that they can sort of easily see which one's which. And we just print their number, their type, and their hit points. Printing their hit points is fairly straightforward. Printing their number is fairly straightforward because it's just 1, 2, 3, 4. The only one that's a bit complicated is this code. It's one of those ones where we have a variable inside a variable. So I will go through that. What it is, because we're not storing, for example, the strength of enemy 6. What we do is we store what type enemy 6 is, and then we have another array that stores the strength of that type. So we have enemy at something 0, and then what's in here is $enemy Z1. So it will look in enemy Z1, it will say, that's 2, which is the number for females. All right, we'll look in enemy underscore ATT 20. And there it will see that, once I find it, we'll see that, right. See that it's the word female. Enemy $ATT20 is female, and then we print the hit points next. All right. Now, as I go, I explained that slightly misleadingly because I gave the impression that it tells you how the strong rating of the monster, and it currently doesn't. It just has the type and the hit points, but it will have the strong rating because, of course, we need that for combat, and it will also have the sneaky rating because that's also used for combat. So yeah, it will have, and again, it won't store how strong the enemy is in this array. It will just store the type, and then we look up how strong a monster of that type is as we go. And then lastly, it says include roll initiative, which is the next thing that we're going to be doing in a subsequent video. So that is what I've done. Now, this game only has 3 types of monsters because it's a specific genre, which is sort of horror, where there's a threat, right? Often that's the case. You're fighting vampires, you're fighting werewolves, you're fighting, in this case, giant mosquitoes. And there might be 2 or 3 different types of them. You know, there might be sort of 2 or 3 different types of zombie, perhaps. But it's not like a fantasy game where there might be 50 or 100 different types of monsters. And if you wanted to do this in a situation where there was a lot of monsters, the way that I've described it here would become a little bit difficult, because look at, when I find it, look at this array where it gives you, for every type of monster, it gives you how many of that monster there are. Well, if there's 50 to 100 types of monsters, is it really going to be practical to have a list of, is it the best way we can do it to have a list of 50 to 100 numbers, most of which will be 0, because usually it'll be an encounter with a specific type of monster. You might have 2 or 3, so you might have a band of werewolves led by a sort of, I don't know, led by a evil necromancer or an evil druid or something like that, right? You might have an evil wizard who's controlling skeletons, and so therefore you might have sort of 2 different types of monsters. But if you had 50 to 100 different types of monsters, any given encounter would be a lot of zeros, and it would be very easy to put the number in slot 66 when you meant slot 65. And so therefore, suddenly, instead of fighting a dragon, you're fighting whatever's next to a dragon. And so the encounter sort of suddenly doesn't make sense. So in the next video, I'll show you a way of doing this, which makes more sense for situations where you have lots of different types of monster. So we can describe that in a sort of shorter way. So that's what I'm going to do in the next video. And then once I've done that, we'll move on to, as I said, the next part of this, which is how we are going to roll initiative. I have done a video on initiative before, but this is a bit more complicated. What I did in the previous video, if you're interested, it's in my combat playlist, is initiative, where you roll to see which side goes first. What we're going to do here is a more complicated system where each individual character in the game has their own initiative score. So each monster rolls its own initiative, and then your player character rolls initiative, and then if you have companions with you, they will roll their own initiative as well, and then everyone goes in that order. All right, so that's what we'll be doing in the immediate future. But for now, I hope that was useful or interesting to at least some of you, and I hope you will tune in next time.